Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for your attendance. It's a pleasure to see you. We really appreciate your support, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of everyone. As many of you would know, we webcast these, and I hope that you will spread the word that, in very simple terms, if you were not able to be here, please look at the webcast. It's my pleasure to welcome you as the current President of RUSI New South Wales. I'd particularly like to acknowledge that we have with us one of our past presidents, David Leese, and could I commend to you, if you haven't seen it, that there is up on our website our 134th birthday celebration, which was last Friday, in fact, here. But the reason I particularly draw your attention to it is there's some quite excellent summaries by our previous past presidents, and sitting and listening to them, I thought I knew basically mostly of our history, but there's some quite interesting stuff, and I suspect in some cases it's actually true. David. So, in a humorous way, I wanted to acknowledge that we've just celebrated our birthday, 134 years of being in existence, which is quite an achievement, I think. And could I commend to you, get up on the website if you haven't seen it, and have a look, please, at our past presidents giving some views. We have a couple of apologies that I just particularly wanted to make, and that is we've had some apologies from our new vice patrons, and Rear Admiral Jonathan Early has just made a point of apologising that he couldn't be with us, and as I'll be reporting to the board, it's a great pleasure that I can report that the new Fleet Commander, Rear Admiral Early, has accepted the role of Vice Patron, and the new Air Commander has also accepted the role of Vice Patron. So one of the real assets that we have is some of the networks that we can exercise, and I just particularly wanted to acknowledge and thank that the two senior commanders, both of them have also in principle committed to the seminar on the 22nd of November. So if you want the opportunity to meet the Fleet Commander and the Air Commander in person, at this time at least, given other commitments, they have committed to be at the seminar on the afternoon of the 22nd of September. So could I give you a warm welcome? Could I acknowledge first our guest speaker of today, Professor Adam Lockyer. Adam, pleasure to see you, and we'll introduce Adam properly in a moment, but I was just reflecting that he actually spoke to us in August 2017. So welcome back, and thank you. I'd like to pay my respects, and in particular, not only to our elders past, present and future, but in particular to those members from First Nation who have served, are serving or will serve. And we'd like to pay appropriate tribute, particularly to that cohort. Some very quick other requests today. If you haven't seen the special RAAF 100th book, which was dedicated by our patron, then please go and have a look at it. It's a great bit of history. Could I just draw your attention to the 50th year, the commemoration of the 50th year since the end of the Vietnam War. That is the 6-monthly exhibition upstairs in the Anzac Memorial. Could I commend that to you if you have not seen it? Finally, don't forget, please, we'd always welcome you as a volunteer. And could I just again identify Greg, standing up the back at the moment. Greg, as well as being our office manager, Greg would like to sell you some of our surplus books. So would you mind having a look at them, please? And if you could help, we'd appreciate that very much. Before getting to the main point, which is again welcoming and listening to the presentation, I'd just like to again celebrate the fact that one of our board members, Diana, who's sitting in the front row, if you do not know Diana, took on the task of developing a new series for us, and the first of the RUSI monographs, which we labelling under the series, the Javelin series, has now been launched. They're online at this time, as most modern publications usually are, and we're going to ask, if you are interested, could you work with us in developing the series by writing or co-writing for it? And we're looking under two broad labels. Looking forward, so, what's your view about something that's challenging us at the moment, or something we could perhaps be considering? Or, as we often in RUSI do, looking back, which is looking at the history of how things have occurred, looking at the issue. And the first of them, very appropriately, Diana's father was a coast watcher in World War II, and so the first of the monographs is actually focusing on a particular aspect of that. So on behalf of the board and everyone, Diana, thank you very much for getting them up. Congratulations. It's my pleasure now to hand over to our event coordinator, Ron Lyons, who will introduce, and then, of course, our speaker. Thank you very much. Ron, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the sixth in our lecture series for 2022. The overall theme for our activities this year is Improving Australia's Regional Security, and the title of today's lecture is Sea Power's Role in Shaping Australia's Strategic Environment, and it'll be presented by Associate Professor Adam Lockyer, the Associate Professor in Strategic Studies at Macquarie University's Department of Security Studies and Criminology. Adam has held a number of academic positions in strategic studies in Australia and the United States. He was the Lowy Institute's 2008 Thorley Scholarship in International Security winner, and has held the prestigious 2015 Fulbright Scholarship in US-Australian Alliance Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Adam was awarded his PhD in Political Science from the University of Sydney in 2009. His most recent book is titled Australian Defence Strategy, Evaluating Alternatives for a Contested Asia. Adam's current book project is exploring the operational dimensions of conventional maritime deterrence. He was also a previous speaker in our lecture series in 2017. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome back to the podium our speaker today, Associate Professor Adam Lockyer.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Ron. Ron has done sort of a fabulous job in the lead up to this, organising my visit today. So, no, thank you both. And as was pointed out, the last time that I spoke here was just after the publication of my last book on Australian defence strategy. And it was a great day. Sandwiches, the Q&A was all fabulous. There was one problem, however, and that was I was holding up my book, and when the discussion began, I was thinking the whole time, geez, that's a really good point. And so I made the point at that stage, that the next time I was writing a book to come and speak to you before it went to press and not after. And so my book project, my current book project is looking at strategic communication, how defence forces, and in particular navies, communicate intention and capabilities to interested foreign observers. So how exercises in particular are observed by foreign actors to build a picture of how you may respond in different contingencies, which then flows through into your defence posture. So today's talk is going to be taking a small snippet of that larger project, where I'll be talking a bit about exercises and how they're interpreted by interested foreign observers to build a picture of how you're going to respond. So two commentators that you're probably both you're all familiar with, Mick Ryan and John Blaxland. Mick Ryan was a recently retired Major General, was the last posting was Commandant to the Australian Defence College, and now lives up in Brisbane doing a lot of commentary for the ABC and others on Ukraine war, amongst other things. John Blaxland is a Professor of Intelligence Studies down at the ANU. Now, both Ryan and Blaxland have written that about the current Taiwanese crisis, that the Chinese are giving us a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, giving us a sneak peek of what a future blockade of Taiwan might possibly look like. So, as you're all familiar with, after the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan earlier in August, only on a sort of drop by less than a day type of visit, this displeased the Chinese, and since then the People's Liberation Army have been undertaking a series of major exercises around Taiwan, demonstrating the fact that they can blockade the island. So if you have a look at the image up here, if you can see it, this is a comparison of the live fire exercises in the last Taiwanese crisis in 95-96 and the current round of exercises that the PLA are undertaking. Now, Mick Ryan argues that first, the coming days, so this is written back before the exercise really kicked off, the coming days will permit us to observe how China and the PLA might think about conducting a naval blockade of Taiwan. In essence, they are telegraphing their operational approach so that we can wargame ways to subvert it in the future. And John Blaxland writes that Beijing's largest ever exercises around Taiwan have offered key clues into its plans for a grueling blockade in the event of war to take the self-ruled island, and revealed an emboldened Chinese military whose plans are worth studying. And to a degree, they're right. So we can look at what's been going on around Taiwan for a sneak peek into how a future blockade, a Chinese blockade of Taiwan, might play out. So first off, through the canal, the Bashi Canal, which is the main entranceway from Pacific Ocean into the South China Sea, we've seen lots of surface activity as well as overflights. Closer into Taiwan, though, we've seen less surface ship activity, and instead we've seen more overflights and missile tests, particularly in the southwest of the country. To the east of Taiwan, this is where some of the major surface activity has been taking place, and this is where they've been using aircraft carriers and large surface combatants. The suggestion here is that in a future blockade of Taiwan, that putting the bulk of the Chinese surface fleet on the east coast would be a buffer to the 7th Fleet trying to come to Taiwan's aid. And closer to Taipei up in the north, this is once again where Taiwan's defences are strongest, and so we've seen less surface ship activity and greater use of aircraft and missiles to demonstrate the fact that they can blockade and cut off Taiwan in the case of an emergency. So, in a way, both Ryan and Blaxland are onto something. Right, we can study their exercise for clues into how a Chinese blockade of Taiwan would be carried out. But their analysis is also missing something. Right? Their analysis is missing the fact that the Chinese know we're watching. Right? So, on one hand, this is a genuine case of how a blockade of Taiwan might play out. But on the other hand, this is also theatre. Right? They're putting on they're demonstrating a story. They're telling us a story about how a blockade would possibly be conducted, so that we have second thoughts about undertaking, sort of coming to Taiwan's aid in case of a major crisis, or more accurately, demonstrating to the Taiwanese themselves that they have the intention and they have the capability of mounting a successful blockade of Taiwan, so don't even think about independence. Right. So what this analysis kind of lacks is the fact that this isn't a sneak peek behind the curtain. This is a theatre, right? The curtains have been drawn back, and this is an intentional demonstration to us that we're supposed to observe and consume. So this brings us to strategic communication and naval exercises. And so sea power is an incredibly flexible instrument. You can use it for very functional tools like enforcing fishing or radar or actual warfighting. But you can also use exercises more generally, but naval exercises in particular, to tell a story to different actors that you're trying to deter or reassure of how a future action might be undertaken. So deterrence, I'm going to focus more on the deterrence side today for time reasons, but at the same time we'll be telling a different story about reassurance, how you can reassure friends and allies that in a contingency this is how we're going to behave, and so you have nothing to fear, you can rely upon us. Or you can tell a different story, which is, if you do X, we will do Y, so you better not do X. And so this is the deterrence side. So deterrence increases the expected costs and risks associated with a future action in the minds of an opposing decision maker. And so we can, naval powers, sea powers, can undertake deterrence in a number of different ways. So up until the 1970s, naval theory tended to emphasise command of the seas. So in this picture, you would have two rival fleets, generally thought about as the British and the French, or the British and the Germans, and you would, in wartime, you would either sink or blockade your enemy's fleet, which would then open up the seas for you to raid their commerce and to conduct operations from sea with little risk of confrontation with the enemy fleet, which has been either sunk or is held up in port. In the 1970s, however, they moved away from command of the seas and they introduced this new concept of sea control. So rather than thinking you're going to have complete control of all the seas, sea control suggests that you can control the sea only at a particular place for a particular time, so there's going to be limits placed upon it. So we can tell a story to opponents that we possess the capability to reach out and seize sea control in your maritime periphery, and from which point we can undertake different actions. We could undertake airstrikes, bombardment, amphibious assault, missile strikes, or blockade. And this is the story that the Americans primarily like to tell, right? So the aircraft carriers conduct naval exercises in forward areas. So in the South China Sea, in the Persian Gulf, in the Mediterranean, in forward areas that they can seize sea control, meaning that any opponent won't be able to threaten the aircraft carrier. So they've got complete air superiority over their bubble. They've got control over subsurface environment as well. So their SSNs are monitoring activity below the surface, and they can control the surface environment as well. So within their perimeter, they've got complete sea control. And they demonstrate this on a regular basis. So this is how the US Navy tends to prefer to have demonstrate conventional maritime deterrence. Alternately, you can have defensive sea control. All right, so Navy folk tend to say that at sea there is no defence and offence. The sea is neutral; it's flat. But they tend to be talking primarily about the tactical and arguably the operational level at that point. Strategically, there is defensive, right? Because a state can choose to defend defensively, so as forces are moving towards your coastline rather than projecting force into the enemy's periphery. So we can try and seize sea control in our coastal areas, and this has been historically, at least since the 1980s, how Australian maritime deterrence has tried to emphasise. So if you read the DIB report, followed by the 87 Defence White Paper, the argument was that we were going to be able to control the maritime approaches through Australia's north, that we were going to be able to sink or shoot down any would-be opponent as they were moving through the air-sea gap to Australia's north, so we had sea control to Australia's north. And by demonstrating that through naval exercises, the hope was that any would-be attacker would be deterred from attacking Australia in the first place. We've got two other ideas here too. We have an offensive sea denial. So sea denial is unlike sea control because you're not trying to achieve control yourself. All you're trying to achieve as an actor attempting a sea denial strategy is to make sure that your opponent doesn't have sea control themselves. So you could think it's a bit like guerrilla warfare at sea, right? Where the guerrillas themselves don't have control over the territory, but you certainly don't have control over that piece of jungle either. So there's a number of different ways you can go about this. Offensive sea denial, you're communicating the fact that you can undertake commerce raiding against their shipping, you can mine their harbours, or you can undertake submarine activity in their coastal areas. But if you're undertaking commerce raiding or submarine activity, you don't have sea control as an actor, but you're denying sea control to your opponent, and you can threaten them with that. There's a few historical examples of offensive sea denial being used in a deterrence fashion. So in 1863, there was a Polish insurgency, and it looked as though both France and Britain might intervene to come to the Polish insurgents' aid. They had fomented the conflict to begin with, and Russia was concerned that they might intervene and Poland might get their independence. So the Russian Tsar ordered his Pacific fleet to San Francisco and ordered his Atlantic fleet to New York. Now, the message sent to both London and Paris was, if you do intervene, we can't hope to defeat you in a naval battle, but what we can do is we can threaten your sea lanes of communication off to North America. Right? So the suggestion here was there was going to be commerce raiding in an offensive fashion, and both France and Britain decided not to intervene in the end. Defensively, okay, this is more the classic sea denial strategy where you can use sea mines on your coastline, you can use fast attack boats, you can use submarines with shorter range to make the sea a really dangerous place. So you don't have sea control of your periphery, but you can deny it to your opponent as well. And this is more or less what Hugh White argues for Australia, right? What Hugh White will argue is that back in the 1980s, DIB could stand up and say, we should have defensive sea control. We should make it impossible for the opponent to be able to project military force towards Australia's coastline. All right? What White will say is the Asia of today is a very different place to the 1980s. We can no longer hope to stop them dead in their tracks. But what we can do is we can buy 20 submarines, we can scatter them across the north of Australia, and no opponent would dare sail their aircraft carriers, their amphibious assault ships, their troop carriers into seas that have these submarines lurking there and they don't know where they are. So you can deny them, you can deter them through sea denial rather than us having sea control ourselves. So what does all this mean? Okay, sea power is really flexible, and it's unlikely that any power is going to be using one of those four broad strategies all the time against all opponents. So during the Cold War, the Soviet Union used a mixture of these strategies when they were trying to deter the United States from attacking the Soviet Union. So closer to their coastline, the dark blue area, that was their sea control zone. Right? This is where, in the event of World War III, the Soviet Navy was going to be able to hold defensive sea control and not permit the American carriers from entering into that space. Further out, we have their sea denial zone. This is where their submarines would be lurking, their backfire and Badger bombers would be flying out to try and make it a really risky prospect for American sea power to get close to the Soviet coastline. So you can see that it isn't all or nothing, right? You can see that there's a mixture going on. And this pattern was demonstrated through a series of exercises, right? So American analysts that were trying to predict what the Soviets would do in the case of the Third World War were carefully examining their exercises to build a picture, and this is the map that evolved. So when we think about China and China copying our tech, they also copy strategy, right? And so when you're thinking about A2AD, so any access area denial, any access is essentially defensive sea control, and area denial is further out, and that is defensive sea denial. And we get this picture sometimes through Chinese doctrine, but also we get just through their patterns of exercises, right? So they build new warships, they build new aircraft carriers. How they're actually going to use this new capability is transmitted by how they train to use it, and Western analysts are carefully monitoring their exercises in order to build that picture. So, linking this back to theory, we've got Robert Jervis, who passed away last year, one of the towering figures in international security studies over many decades. And he spoke about indices compared to signals. So, a signal is something that an actor tries to get across to an opponent, but it's relatively low cost, it's quick. It could be something like a diplomatic communique, or right through to an operational assertion, so like a phone-up, right? On the one hand, the opponent knows that you're doing this to communicate a message, right? But it's also relatively cheap. A single ship transit or a diplomatic communique, talk is cheap, right? Whereas you've got these other things called an index or indices, right, which are major events. It could be a war, it could be an operation, or it could be a major naval exercise, which are too costly, too resource intensive in order to just be a bluff, right? There's got to be some truth to it. So when we're looking at, say, the Taiwanese example again, when the PLA is undertaking this mock blockade of Taiwan, there's got to be some truth to that as well, right? Because it's too big, it's too well rehearsed to just have been pulled out of their pocket as a bluff, right? There's something to it. So compare this to what we're seeing in the Cold War as well. If you're looking at the pattern of exercises that the United States was undertaking in the 1980s, there was a real shift between the Carter administration and the Reagan administration. Up to Carter, what the United States was hoping to achieve was more of deterrence through defensive sea control. They were going to cut off the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, and so the Soviet Atlantic Fleet wouldn't be able to get through and intercept the reinforcements moving from North America across to Europe in the event of a Third World War. So the message was trying to be communicated across to the Soviets was that don't start a war because you won't be able to break out of our barrier, and we will be able to ship our massive reinforcements via sea across the Atlantic into Europe and win a Third World War. When Reagan came to power, the pattern of exercises changed sharply. So whereas the pattern of NATO and US-led exercises during the 70s and up to 1980 were primarily the southern side of Iceland, what Reagan wanted to demonstrate is offensive sea control, right? That we can not only seize their sea control, but we can do it in a really forward position. And so the pattern of exercises changed, and we had Ocean Safari tended to be in the far north Norwegian Sea, and it was far more aggressive. So A6s would fly off American aircraft carriers, fly towards the Coral Peninsula as though they were about to bomb the Coral Peninsula, and the last minute sort of veer off and bomb north of Norway instead. It's a very clear message, right? We can do this, right? So don't even think about starting a conflict. So what does this mean for Australia? And what does this mean? What's the message that we're sending off in terms of our pattern of exercises? Well, Australia's a really interesting case. Australia's an interesting case because we try and do a lot of these different strategies. So we're a balanced force, we have capabilities across the spectrum, and our exercise pattern is a reflection of that. So you take Ocean Explorer, for example. Ocean Explorer is an exercise that's conducted around the Australian coastline. It's moved around Australian coastline between the iterations, and that's intentional so that our sailors and naval officers get to experience experience in different environments around Australia. But the Ocean Explorer is a sea control exercise in Australia's periphery. So this would be a case of defensive sea control, and the message that we're sending off to peer competitors is that we can see sea control in our coastal areas, so don't even try to attack us. But we also undertake amphib exercises as well, which is a whole different kettle of fish. Now the LHDs have been appearing in Ocean Explorer a bit recently, but it's Talisman Sabre has been the major offensive sea control exercise that Australia has been undertaking. It's a bilateral exercise with the Americans, where we're trying to learn from America's experience about how to undertake amphibious operations. And then we've got RIMPACT, right, which is, we've been a member, been showing up to RIMPACT ever since its inception. It's a major exercise off Hawaii, US-led, where it's a multilateral exercise, and many nations from around the Pacific Rim show up to undertake a series of activities that primarily are based around offensive sea control as well. So if you're an observer and you're looking at Australia's pattern of exercises, what is the message that you're receiving in terms of different scenarios and different contingencies? What would happen which one of these exercises would be used against you, right? And I think that what we're seeing here is just a reflection of Australia's relative power compared to different regions. So you often hear that Australia is a middle power, right? Which is kind of true, but kind of not. Because if you compare Australia to the South Pacific nations, right, we're a superpower, at the very least a great power in the South Pacific, right? We undertake unilateral operations in the South Pacific. We don't hesitate to intervene on our own in the South Pacific, and compared to their size of their economies, population, militaries, we're a giant, right? And so when if you're an officer in one of their militaries, they might be thinking about a coup, or if you're a disgruntled community leader thinking about an insurgency, and you're looking at Australia about, well, how will Australia likely respond in case I undertake my malign action? Well, then you're probably looking at something like Talisman Sabre, right? Which is, we've been practicing Talisman Sabre, a reflection of how we would do East Timor again, and now we're getting really good at it. Right, and so you might be deterred from undertaking your malign action because you've been watching Talisman Sabre. Then you have a look at something like Ocean Explorer. That has nothing to do with the Pacific Ocean, the Pacific states. Right, that has to do with more of our peer competitors. Right, and so Australia is also a middle power in Asia. And if you're looking at sort of peer competitors, we're looking at the Southeast Asian nations that might be thinking about undertaking hostile action against Australia. Then you'd be looking at something like Ocean Explorer as a defensive sea control strategy. And then you have RIMPACT. RIMPACT doesn't have to do with that. RIMPACT has to do with China, right? And increasingly about China, about Australia being able to being completely interoperable with the American Navy and being able to undertake forward offensive sea control operations alongside our American allies. So you can see that if you're looking at Australia's exercises, they do seem to be broad, they seem to be covering a lot of bases, but that's about Australia's unusual position in the world, right? Whereas, say, the Americans are not a one-trick pony, but they tend to always emphasise offensive sea control, right? A very weak nation might always be emphasising defensive sea denial, whereas we try to undertake a range of tasks, but we're communicating to different audiences. So I'm going to leave it there, I think, because I want to leave lots of time for questions and your comments on how exercises can be used as strategic communication.
Thanks, Adam. Would you, firstly, when you ask a question, state your name and affiliation, and then go on. Thank you.
Paul Simonaz, Army. Is the Pacific a unique case study, whereas NATO assures strategic response? The Americans argue that they have strategic uncertainty in the Pacific. And has not the ball, first point, and has not the ball game changed? The US Army and US Marine Corps now want to both get involved in the maritime battle space. Distributed fires, dispersal across much of the Western Pacific, getting rid of tanks, delivering precision fires over huge distances. The Navy wants to go hypersonic. They want to keep their ships back. Is that the new way in the Pacific? Is that the new way that sea control is going to be seen in the Pacific?
So a very good question. So there's two broad camps, and it goes by different names, but there's two broad camps within the American debate about how to best deter China. The first one is, well, the culture of the US Navy should trace back to Mahan, and it's very aggressive, very forward. We have to get out and sink the enemy ships, seize sea control, and then we're going to pound them to dust. Right? And so that's their instinct. That's their culture, and it's ingrained in them. But what they're now finding is that when they war game this scenario, they lose. And since 2019, attempting to get sea control in through the first island chain and pounding Shanghai into dust, it just doesn't work. As soon as you concentrate your ships, Chinese precision strike takes out your fleet. So the US Navy says, we still want to do what we've always done, but we know that as soon as we concentrate our ships, they take us out at our assembly point. So what we're going to do is we're going to have distributed lethality. So the ships are going to be spread out. Every ship is going to be able to be a sea control ship on its own. So rather than operating as a battle group with your SSN underneath to get sea control underneath the ocean and your overhead, every platform is going to be able to have its complete 360 protection. And we're going to sail this in through the South China Sea and still do what we always want to do. But it's clear with the wargaming scenario building that it just doesn't work. And so the Marines and the Army are saying, well, rather than that, we can tighten the chain. Right? And this goes by a range of different names, either tightening the chain, porcupine strategy, whatever else. But the idea would be that you can try to enclose China through the first island chain by having through using precision strike on your own. So using the new marine model, I'll be able to operate in the choke points and close them off to the Chinese fleet. You don't need tanks anymore for this type of operation, so we get rid of tanks, and we're using missiles and stuff instead, right? It's really sort of back to sort of my thing. It's either offensive sea control, or you deter them through defensive sea control as well. So nothing's new, right? This is going back to the Carter. Do you use the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap and you block in the Soviet fleet, or do you try to demonstrate the overwhelming naval superiority and they can't even in their home waters? So there's a real everything's that's old is new again, and there's that Carter-Reagan debate happening now, right? my contribution to that is it's not what you can do that matters in terms of deterrence. It's what you can demonstrate, right? Which is a different thing, right? Because we might all be able to get together in our offices and we can war game this and we can run it in a scenario and we win every single time through using our strategy, all right? Whether it's offensive, defensive, doesn't matter. But in terms of deterrence, what you need to do is then be able to take it to sea and demonstrate it to your opponent. Because it's at sea in those naval exercises where the opponent is then going to come to their own realisation that we can't win this, so we better not. Does that make sense?
Ian Curry, retired soldier. The thing that fascinates me about all this defence stuff and defending Australia is since we retired the F-111, we seem to lack a long-range strike aircraft that could not only strike land targets, but could also strike maritime targets. Super Hornet is a sort of in-between aeroplane, which seems to have predominantly a strike role over an air-to-air role. The F-35 is another strange aeroplane in that it tries to be a number of things. Can you reflect on what I've just said and provide your comments in relation to what you've just told us?
Yeah, I mean, so there's some commentary around whether or not we should get the B-21 for all the reasons that you've suggested. And this is...
I don't even know what it looks like.
Yeah. So we might either be seeing something like that in the DSR that's going to come out next year. My guess is rather than necessarily Australia acquiring that capability ourselves, next year we'll be told that there's going to be a lot more B2s based in Australia and SSNs, both British and American, either permanently based here or in high rotation through here. So the capabilities review will say we've got these gaps, like you pointed out. We can't easily plug those gaps, but our friends and allies have those capabilities, so come visit. So you probably might see something like that.
Michael Flynn, Brucey out of Navy. It was said that the blockade of Japan, and particularly oil, led directly to or indirectly to World War II. We recently had the Chief of Staff of the Japanese Ground Self-Defence Force, General Yoshida, visit us, although I didn't see anything in the public press. Where does Japan now fit into this mosaic?
That's a very good question because it really depends. Historically, in terms of this, that Japan has had more maritime capability than China, so its strategy has primarily been defensive sea control, somewhat similar to Australia. You can't get to us, so don't try. Now you're seeing that the Japanese are exercising the tempo of their operations and exercises, and it's increasing more multilateral exercises, which are more focused about one, offensive sea control. So in a contingency involving Taiwan, you might see the Japanese operating in a more offensive capacity, but they're in sort of a similar situation to Australia as well, it depends on who we're talking about in what type of contingency. If you're dealing with something with North Korea, for example, they could be offensive. Against China, they could be defensive. In a scenario involving Taiwan, there could be a combination of both.
David Lees, former president of the Visiting Institute. I was a soldier for a while too. Thank you for your erudite but very easy to understand presentation. You explained those concepts very, very well. when do you, first part of my question is, when do you see your book being released? And the second part of my question is, you spoke about Paul Dibb's 1987 white paper, the concept of defence in depth forward of the continent with strategic strike as the furthest out, followed by maritime denial of the air-sea gap, then defence of the coastline, I guess, sea control around the Australian coastline, followed by defence on the actual continent itself if anyone penetrated. Now, you contrasted that to Hugh White saying that defensive sea control around the continent isn't going to cut the mustard today, and that we need to think about sea denial, particularly through the Melanesian and Indonesian archipelago. My concern about both those approaches is that while the initial thought in 87 was that everything would come from or through the archipelago, we also have the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and the Southern Ocean, all of which, even though there are mounting bases for an invasion of Australia in the same way, still in maritime terms create major obstacles for us. And I wonder how you see those various dilemmas playing out in relation to the Defence Strategic Review.
Thank you. So first off, in terms of the timeline for the book, maybe end of next year, hopefully. So the historical material for the book is primarily coming from the Reagan era. So as I kind of hinted at, the Soviets were exercising in a pattern that implied that there was this area of sea control and area of sea denial, and they were building a pattern of that. And then on the American side, you had Carter, which was more defensive, and then Reagan, which was more that offensive sea control. It's a good period for historical buffs because the Americans are currently in the process of declassifying all those documents. So I hope to, as they're declassified, be one of the first to get my little hands on them and then be able to publish them so I can sort of bring that to the world. I'd be one of the first to bring that to the world. So it's a bit of a moving mosaic because of those documents. And in terms of comparison with Deb and White and the current strategic review, capabilities review. So I think that one of the reasons why the Dib report has had such a cultural impact on Australian defence thinking for decades is because he effectively told a story. All right? And so a lot of what I've been talking about today has been telling stories. But he told a story, right? So Australia has a technological edge over our competitors. We've got this air-sea gap to Australia's north. Any would-be attacker needs to come across the air-sea gap. So all we need to do is shoot them down or sink them as they come across, and the Australian Army can then pick up any survivors that wash ashore. It's a compelling story which you can tell to the layman on the street and they get it, right? It makes sense. And so when you get down to the capabilities, the layperson on the street can start to tell you, well, if that's the vision, these are the type of things you buy, right? And so when the ADF went to the Australian public and said, we want to increase defence spending to buy all this kit, it made sense, and it's an easy sell. Then Kim Beazley then did this jet-setting tour of the region, and he could tell the story really simply and clearly to our neighbours too, saying, yeah, sure, we're talking about coming from or through the archipelago to Australia's north. It's not about you, right? This is just about defending the moat. So it was a compelling story, and that's why it's been so powerful for so long. And I think that the task for the current review is to tell a story that's equally compelling, and to tell the Australian public why it is that we need to be able to be active in the South Pacific and in through Melanesia, in through Southeast Asia, in the Indian Ocean, and also to Australia South as well. Because if you can tell that story, then the capabilities are almost secondary, where it might be a capabilities review, but you don't need to actually spell out the capabilities, because we should be able to infer what those capabilities are. And after you tell that compelling story, the Australian public will be more willing to spend more on their defence, which we're going to need over the next decade.
Last question.
Adam, great stuff. Firstly, I'm Ian Brooks, Army retired, former editor of the Manual of Land Warfare, working with Gratian. One thing that's always puzzled me in the various presentations we've had in this series is no one is talking about eyes in the sky. Satellites have become incredibly cheap to launch and to position. Australia should have a whole cluster of these things, possibly geostationary. Would you care to comment?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the reasons why I'm focusing mostly on naval exercises is because it's been relatively easy to watch naval exercises for decades, if not millennia, right? So when you go to sea, opponents show up and they can stay in close vicinity of your ships. They can see your tactics. Everything's there in the open. So you need to be able to use your fleet, train with your fleet tactics often and in the open. So it's an important vehicle for communicating to opponents about exactly how you're going to use. But the two sides of the coin is that even back in the 1980s, as soon as there was cloud cover, the satellites couldn't see through. Whereas now, there's greater transparency. So the way that Army and Air Force exercises are conducted are being watched more closely than they have in previous decades, because the satellites are getting so good. So there's a greater amount of transparency about what's going on. Now, whether or not Australia needs its own satellites, because it's probably, I really don't know, to tell the truth, because I don't have a classified clearance, so I don't know what Five Eyes is sending around the place. I don't know if we need our own satellites because we can get everything that we need from the Yanks, or I don't. That's sort of above me, so I don't know what we don't know. So it could well be that the British and the Yanks have got such good coverage in the satellites, and we get everything that we don't need our own satellites. I don't know, but that's sort of probably a good question for someone who has sort of a higher security clearance than I have.
Thank you, Professor, for a incredibly interesting and relevant paper. We appreciate it very much.
About 60 years ago, US President Kennedy said we live in interesting times. I suspect we are currently living in interesting times. So I think probably RUSI is very relevant to RUSI. RUSI's role is to enhance the discussion and the debate about security and defence issues in Australia, and I think your paper adds immeasurably to that. And we thank you very much.
It's my pleasure as President to present Andrew with a symbolic but nevertheless very sincere thank you. We gave him the offer of a tie. He apparently hasn't worn out his previous tie, so in that sense he said, no, I'm fine. But thank you for a superb presentation. We really appreciate your help. Thank you. I have seen a commentary that exercise could well have been a deception plan, as distinct from a real plan, and that if China wants to take Taiwan very quickly, it would be a special forces operation, and all of that was essentially a deception plan. Well, you notice I've just advised the Chinese that we're aware of that. So it's a fascinating topic, and I'd like to finish with this comment. RUSI is planning to make a presentation to the Defence Review. I'd urge you to do so, and whether you believe or wish to take some of the points that our presentation has raised today, I hope, like me, it stimulated your thinking and forced you to face some hard facts, which is we've got some key people in the next short time making some very serious recommendations to government at a very tight time of budget. And if you aren't thinking about and putting a view, could I remind you of the reality of the political process? A federal member needs to know how many letters have come in saying, yes, we need 3 more DDGs, that has my support. They also need to know that no letters came in saying, we need 3 more DDGs, that has my support. If you do not understand that that is the way the political process tends to operate, I would urge you not to leave the commentary to somebody else. We are all involved in this particular exercise. RUSI will put its view. I would urge you to put yours in the sense of how I've just described how our process works. Again, Andrew, thank you so much. It was a very stimulating and very useful mind operation as well as presentation. As we finish, we have a board meeting today at 3 o'clock, and if you have any issues that you'd like to draw to the attention of the board, well then please use the next brief time to just remind us or make a comment. Could I just in advance say to you that, could I remind you that our broad theme for the second half of the year is exploring the AUKUS agreement, and could I just remind you that if you are not aware, we were planning that on the 3rd of September there would be a flyover of the Anzac Memorial and we'd land a Huey in Victoria Barracks. You'll be pleased to know that we might still do that when the bureaucracies concerned make up their mind that they will approve it. So we've deferred the 3rd of September, but what has been approved, if you wish to do a bit of travel, is we will put the Huey on display and overfly with caribou and so on in the Illawarra region, and the real difference has been the local network down there has funded the fuel. The DVA is still deciding whether it will fund the fuel for the Sydney event, and that's why that's going to be deferred or won't happen. Could I remind you that our next monthly lecture is again on AUKUS. One of the subset AUKUS issues is cyber security and cyber warfare, and that's the topic for October. On the 22nd of November, the major seminar, What's Happened 1 Year On, with AUKUS, and I repeat that at this stage we have the commitment of 2 of our 3 Commander Vice Patrons to come and attend, subject to other pressures. And so as we finish, we'd request your support in the following practical ways. Would you please tell people about us? Don't forget, please, that we have an AGM coming up at the end of the October lecture. If there's any issue, particularly with relationship to the Defence Review that is we've just mentioned, please try to input that through us if necessary. Thank you to everyone who's organised today in terms of lunching, setting up, etc. We appreciate that very welcome support. And as we finish today, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate your attendance.